All right now Bay is taking a picture of some nice mosses, and mosses are very common in these conifer woods, along with ferns as well. This is called a pincushion moss, and it's growing at the base of a sweet birch, also called a black birch. And in the Boston Hills here, we find the black birch growing in association with the hemlocks. They like each other. And when we find one, we usually find the other in this neighborhood. So, aside from the black birch, pay heed to the mosses here for a moment, because they have a very interesting relationship with the trees and other vegetation in the area. By their growing form, mosses actually compete with the other vegetation here because they function as a nutrient sponge. And so they soak up nutrients before they get to the root tip zones of the trees and many of the plants. So they are living in competition with the other vegetation in the area in that regard. All right now we're just turning around and getting a picture of the woods that we just walked through. And as you see, we're on top of a ridge here, and this is where the hemlocks have taken over. And one of the very interesting things about the hemlock is that they create a very deep shade. It's what we call a blue shade. In the northern hardwood forest, we have what's called a green shade. And that means essentially that the trees and their leaves are reflecting the green spectrum that exists from sunlight. Well, here, these trees reflect the blue spectrum. And as such, they create this very dark shade. And when you couple that with the highly acidic soils, you can appreciate that there are not too many plants that could live in this neighborhood. We're picking up the trail as we head along the ridge, heading down to the eternal flame. And you'll see erosion is a factor here. A lot of roots are exposed, and the soil is very heavily compacted. Lots of people find their way down here. And that could be very rough on tree roots, and a number of the trees in this immediate area have gone into decline, probably as a result of that root compaction in particular. Okay. You can get a nice view of this red pine plantation from here. You can see that the trees are planted in nice rows. And these trees have probably been here 70 or more years. And as we move through this area, we will start to see cherry and red maple scattered throughout, topping many of these red pine here and there. And of course, as a result, we'll start to see them in decline. So this is a really nice red pine plantation in this section of Shale Creek. And ordinarily, when pine like this are planted, they're managed. And that means through the years, they're thinned out, allowing others to grow thicker and taller, and then they're harvested and the lumber is used. But as is often the case with governmental agencies, staff is lost, priorities shift, and the management does not happen. And that's exactly what's occurred here. So they've been left on their own for this period of time, and probably in the next 15 years or so, they'll pretty much disappear as the hardwoods take over. It's always just a matter of time. And they're getting close to that period where the native hardwoods have intruded and are gradually putting the pine into decline. Birch. Okay, so here's ash, and in this case we've got black birch and white ash intruding in here. And as we move through, we'll also see a bunch of red maple. And so they gradually are making a difference here in terms of the composition of the plantation. Okay. We can also see some young beech holding on to their leaves a little further into the plantation. And I see some older beech making their way through here as well. So this is the natural order of things when a plantation is put in. All right, everybody, here along the ridge is another new tree for you, although this one is not in very good shape. This is an American chestnut. Back in the day, the American chestnut made up 25% of many of our northern hardwood forests. Every fourth tree was a chestnut. But in the very early 1900s, an Asian chestnut was brought in from Japan and was brought into the New York City area, and they brought with them the chestnut blight, which is a fungal disease. And it's a disease that does not kill the Asiatic chestnuts, but it does so to the American. So in the course of 50 years, by 1950, 80% of the American chestnuts were gone from our forests. And this is one that persisted for many years, and then gradually, and I watched it happen, this one went into decline and is now essentially completely dead, except for the fact that it sprouts new growth, which is quite common amongst the chestnut. The only problem is this will continue to grow until they become a teenager, and then once they're a teenager, then the blight gets them then. And so it's been a harsh cycle. But since the 1980s, the American Chestnut Society has worked diligently to find resistant strains and to repopulate the American chestnut in our northern hardwood forests. So maybe your grandkids will see him again in abundance in our woods. This is another new one for you. This is a tree that needs full sunlight, and these are the leaves of the tree. This is an aspen. This is a big tooth aspen. And so when we find them in areas like this, they're fronting the forest. That means they're along trails and they have ample sunlight. But they will not live very long as they get crowded out by others. The aspen, if you remember, is the genus Populus. And this is grandidentata, or big tooth aspen. And they're in the willow family, which is Salicaceae. So we have the genus Salix of the willows and the genus Populus of the poplars, both in Salicaceae. Here's an area, we're taking a picture of a nice red maple, nice mature red maple in the midst of this plantation. And as Bay kind of scans through this area, you'll see a number of pine have perished, or others are in decline in this immediate area. And that's basically because of the shading factor of this and other more mature hardwoods that I can see in this immediate area. So you're seeing the transition gradually of a pine plantation to what will become a native northern hardwood forest. Okay, here's a new leaf for you. And the tree is right next door, and it has quite an unusual looking bark, kind of tight overlapping scales and growing quite straight. It might remind you a little bit of the tulip tree in terms of how tall and straight they're growing. And Bay is going to scan all the way up to the top here. This is the second of our magnolias. So the tulip tree, if you remember Liriodendron tulipifera, this is a magnolia as well, in the magnolia family, Magnoliaceae. This is Magnolia, which is the genus Acuminata, which speaks of the pointed nature of the leaves. Acuminate means pointed. So this is the leaf of what's commonly called the cucumber tree, or the cucumber magnolia. So this is our second in that family that we find as an associate in our northern hardwood forest. What a pretty tree, huh? Taking a picture now on the forest floor of one of our evergreen herbs. This is called partridge berry. And when it comes to the herbs of the forest, we speak of the spring ephemerals, which are those that grow in the early spring and then disappear when the shade comes out, as we mentioned before. Then we have the summer greens. They come out early, but they persist throughout the summer, and they're somewhat shade tolerant. And then the third type of herbaceous plant we have growing in these woods, we simply call the evergreens. So the evergreens obviously persist through winter and maintain themselves in this manner until new growth comes forth in the spring. So we have the spring ephemerals, we have the summer greens, and we have the evergreens. And these are the types of plants that grow, the herbaceous plants in these northern hardwood forests. Concept that I'd like to share with you here is called phenology. So we spoke of physiognomy, forest physiognomy, which is the layering of a forest. Forest phenology speaks of the life cycle events of a system. And to share with you the notion of forest phenology, which has to do with the life cycle events. The notion of forest herbs that I took you through is one expression of forest phenology, working through spring ephemerals, summer greens, and evergreens. Another way of looking at phenology is through a broader context. And we can just look through the year at the major life cycle events of a northern hardwood forest. And here in March, for instance, you have snow melt, and you have the beginning of the spring ephemerals popping up. In April, the ephemerals are up, and the forest floor becomes quite green, and the vascular flow in trees and shrubs are underway in April. Once we reach mid-May is when the canopy closes, the ephemerals start to disappear, the summer greens continue. And then as we move into the summer The flowering plants of spring in the forest dissipate, disappear, and we move into the quieter time of summer in terms of the colors. And then, of course, from there we move into the fall with the turning of leaf color and the shedding of leaves and the dormancy to follow. So that speaks of the life cycle events of a forest in more general terms. And so that includes both the herb level that we discussed and the more general forest experience relative to phenology.